Welcome to the Energy Conversations podcast, your go-to source for unpacking the complexities of the South African energy sector. My name is Thokozile Zambane. I will be your guide, and every 2 weeks, we will be on a journey of bridging the knowledge gap surrounding South Africa's energy sector and the transition to a low-carbon economy. Welcome back to the Energy Conversations podcast, where we break down the complexities of the South African energy sector into digestible insights and explore pivotal topics shaping the future of energy in South Africa and beyond. I am your host, Thokozile Zambane, and today we will be delving into the vital role of grid connection and the integration of renewable energy into South Africa's existing infrastructure. As we continue to navigate South Africa's energy transition, understanding how the grid operates and evolves is key to unlocking sustainable energy solutions. I am honored to be joined today by the Grid Queens, as they are affectionately known in the industry, and they will be helping us unpack this topic. Joining us is Naniki Nzuza, Principal Grid Engineer at Mainstream Renewable Power, and Vuyolwethu, who is the lead wind engineer at Red Rocket. Together, we'll explore how grid infrastructure and management is adapting to meet the demands of the growing renewable energy industry and what this means for the future of South Africa's energy landscape. Before we dig into today's topic, let's begin with some introductions. Please could I ask each of you to introduce yourselves and share a bit about your current role in the energy sector. Naniki, if I can start with you, please.
Good evening, ladies, and thank you so much, Thokozile, for this invite. My name is Naniki Nzuza. I am a Principal Grid Engineer with Mainstream, as you mentioned. I have just recently joined Mainstream. Prior to that, I was a Senior Grid Manager with Mulilo for about 3 years, primarily doing the same role in terms of grid advisory role within projects of from feasibility through construction. And recently, with my role in Mainstream, I get involved also in commercial projects where I'm overseeing grid code compliance, as well as investigations and on. Prior to that, I was a network operations manager and a senior grid engineer in Eskom, and that's where the majority of my career span was for just 17 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naniki. Vuyo, if I could ask you to briefly introduce yourself and share a bit about your current role in the energy sector.
Thank you, Toko. I am Matiwane, and I am a lead wind engineer at Red Rocket, South Africa. I have been in the industry my whole career. I've worked on IPP projects since being window one while working at Eskom, and I have been in the IPP space, private space, for the past 6 years, and an active member and a contributing member on various working groups with Subvia and Zoea, and in the renewable energy industry. And until earlier this year, I fulfilled the role of an IPP representative at the Grid Code Advisory Committee. So my experience ranges from developing projects, the interconnection of projects with my experience from Eskom, and currently at Red Rocket, I oversee basically the development, the design, the yield analysis, and everything related to the construction and operations of our wind energy assets.
Thank you very much, ladies. And I'd like us to begin this episode with just laying the groundwork for our discussion and getting back to basics and the basics of grid infrastructure. So before we dive into the complexities of grid management and renewable energy integration, Naniki, I'd like to start with you. Please, could you explain what is the grid and what are the infrastructure components that make up the grid?
Thank you for the question. And I guess, like you say, probably taking it back to the fundamentals. So in terms of the grid infrastructure, and here I'm primarily talking about what we term as the primary equipment. We talk about generators, which is really the source of the power, where we would have either coal-fired fossil-based energy sources to what we now have as your renewable energy sources. from the source of the grid in terms of all of these generators also providing us with the frequency for the grid. Then the power that's generated gets transmitted through what we see as the power lines, through the structures that, heavy structures that you would see traversing the landscape of South Africa, really. And that is the backbone of the grid. Most of the time when people talk about grid, they think the power system and the power lines, really. From the power lines we get from the transmission system, we get transformers that would then transform this high voltage power to distribution networks. And in the distribution networks, we would have distribution substations. From here is where you would get municipalities as well as your large industrial customers taking off power. And then this lands us at the end of this value chain, which is now at the load centers. And obviously within this space, there's also other things which I guess I'll touch on a little bit later on. But within the load centers, we would normally talk about urban networks as well as rural networks. I think typically where you see power wooden poles and that also traversing townships and farmlands and stuff would be what we term the rural networks, where in the urban areas, typically you don't see the lines because they are generally done as cables. So that's the primary equipment. Then all of that is almost overlaid with what we call secondary plant equipment. And here we talk about protection systems, control systems, as well as what gives communication systems that give visibility for your control centers to be able to monitor this whole power system. So essentially, that is the skeleton, if I call it that, for the grid.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much for that explanation and really breaking it down. And now that we've established the fundamental components of the grid, I'd like us to now unpack and discuss how the grid is regulated, particularly when it comes to independent power producers. Vuyo, in terms of regulation, how is the use of the grid by IPPs regulated?
To answer the question, the use of the grid is primarily regulated by the Energy Regulator of South Africa, which is NERSA in this case, governed by the Electricity Act. And some of the key aspects in terms of how the use is being regulated by the regulator is basically through the licensing/registration process that is basically in place. As we would know previously, IPPs had to basically obtain a generation license from NERSA to connect to the grid. And this is to ensure compliance to regulations and as well as other environmental regulations and other aspects of the facility itself on how it operates and performs and interacts with the power system. And these are not necessarily limited to technical aspects of the facility and how it interacts with the grid. There's obviously also reporting that is required as part of the report, as part of the regulation that is done by NERSA. On a technical perspective, the grid code is there as a way of enforcing compliance for IPPs to adhere to all the necessary procedures that need to be followed to connect and access the grid. So the grid code and the grid connection requirements outline the conditions and as well as the requirements under which IPPs can connect to the network and can continue to use the network in a manner that does not compromise security of supply. And here we talk about the technical requirements specifically to how they interact and behave once they are connected to the grid. So it's a number of aspects that are used to try and regulate the connection of IPPs onto the network. So there are a lot more of these, technical and non-technical, that are used to regulate the connection and interaction of the IPPs with the national grid. So and they are used to try and encourage investment, but at the same time to ensure that we still remain with a stable grid as well as make sure that we have continued security of supply to our end user customers.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Vuyo, and thank you both for just providing a great foundational understanding of the grid and really how it is regulated. I'd like us to shift focus and look at specific challenges that are faced in integrating renewable energy projects into existing grid infrastructure. Naniki, from your perspective, what are the specific challenges that that are encountered typically when integrating renewable energy projects into the existing grid infrastructure?
Thank you for that question. I guess as we stand currently in the energy space, yeah, there's been lots of challenges that have led to a number of robust debates. So the first one, I guess, is just the elephant in the room in terms of grid constraints. And what we know as that has been termed largely from the utility that there is no grid, for instance, in the Greater Cape. And this was as indicated in the report that was released by Eskom and the system operator that is termed the GCCA, which is the Generation Capacity Assessment report. And follow on, so that's where the basis of where we start from, that it's the first challenge currently. And followed on by that was an addendum that was released by the system operator on this GCCA report that indicated that there can be some capacity that could be released if curtailment is allowed. We also know that there is debates around that. So the first thing is grid constraints really. I think the other thing that the utility has also bemoaned is the fact that there's been a rapid uptake of renewable projects that's almost outpaced and outrun the infrastructure development. As such, what the TDP, the Transmission Development Program implementation, has been lagging all of these projects that are coming online, which has led to the problem that we are sitting with. And I think from a process perspective, when we talk about how a project connects on the grid, so as a developer, I would need to apply to Eskom for what they call a cost estimate letter, ASL. There's been challenges that have been mentioned in the industry around issues of timelines when you would get a physical cost estimate letter. In some cases, developers getting a cost estimate letter a day before bidding for the public procurement process. So from a timeline perspective, it's been mentioned as a concern. Other challenges around also discrepancies when it comes to what we call a scope of what a project and a developer would need to outlay from a let's say self-build works, substations and the likes that they would need to put down, that what is stated in the cost estimate letter would be completely different to what they would get from in a budget quote phase, which is the milestones that Eskom implements. Besides the scope change, there will obviously also be cost differences that will put a challenge to the finances of a project. I think in remedying all of this and some mitigation that Eskom has put forward is, for instance, one of the other things that's been causing a lot of debate, which they call the grid capacity allocation rules, as well as the gated connection rules, trying to provide some sort of a level ground of how projects can contest for this very limited grid. And then I'll leave it there for now. I mean, there's a number of them I can mention.
Thank you very much, Naniki. And I'd like to build on to some of the insights that you've shared around challenges in integrating renewable energy, and specifically the pressing issue of curtailment. And I'd like to bring you into the conversation here. And given our current energy landscape, why are we talking about curtailment when we have energy insecurity? Does it matter whose power gets to the grid first under these circumstances?
Thank you, Toko. In the context of energy security, like you mentioned, as we are dealing with an energy crisis, the easy answer is really no, it doesn't matter who gets to get connected first. However, we need to set the rules of the game way up front in terms of how we actually connect to the grid in a way that is non-discriminatory to generators, basically. So it doesn't matter who gets to connect first, but it matters how IPPs or generators get connected to the grid. So for the longest time, Eskom has been the sole off-taker of renewable energy that is generated by independent power producers in the country through the REAP program. However, we now have the private offtake market. So now with these two programs, I will call them programs for simplicity, need to coexist. And if the rules are different, then there is no longer going to be fairness amongst how capacity is being allocated to generators. So we need to level the playing field and come up with a solution that will work in the long term without discriminating against technologies and as well as who the off-taker is. So when you simply just think about it, all the renewable energy power that is being generated is basically just going to be bought by someone. So regardless of who the off-taker is, basically the process needs to become the same. So in the eyes of the power system itself, the off-taker does not matter, to be quite honest. And so it's immaterial when it comes to the processes that need to be followed. So giving preferential treatment to one program over the other then goes against what we have set out within the grid codes regarding non-discriminatory access to the grid. So that is basically why we have to have a conversation about curtailment as well as the ICA rules that Naniki just mentioned. So, and the simple way of answering that question, it doesn't matter, but we need to make sure that how we access and connect to the grid, regardless of who the off-taker is, the rules are the same. And that is what we are trying to make sure is established at this very point in time.
Thank you for that, Vuyo. And I think maybe this might be a good time just as a reminder or as an explanation for our listeners on what curtailment is. In layman's terms, what is curtailment?
I think the first thing to try and highlight is curtailment as we know it, as we've been used to in terms of the REAP PPAs up until now, or at least bid window 6, I think it was only introduced, at least the idea was only spoken about after around bid window 6, between window 7 was actually issued. So curtailment as we used to know it was basically a means of the system operator that uses to try and manage the stability within the grid. So you would get a situation where the frequency needs to be kept within basically operational limits, which is the standard frequency being 50 hertz. So there are areas or situations where you may find that there is a lot of generation within the system that actually results in an increase in the system frequency. So in situations like that, where the system is basically unstable, the system operator will issue instructions to try and curtail the plant or facilities to try and reduce or bring the system frequency to levels that are safe for the power system to operate. So it is important. This is an important feature that is used as a security of supply measure for stability by the system operator. And then the second aspect of curtailment, as we are talking about now, we talk about congestion curtailment, which is basically a similar approach in terms of reducing system capacity, but in this situation is to try and alleviate grid capacity constraints. So it's to try and don't know if we're not eliminating, but we're trying to improve the capacity challenges that we're currently having. So basically what curtailment in this context that we're trying to establish now is a means for the system operator to try and maximize the use of the existing grid infrastructure try and unlock capacity within the constrained areas, and they've used the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape as subject regions that these would actually be implemented. So it's basically a means to try and use existing infrastructure to try and elevate or unlock capacity in these constrained areas, and which basically would require a significant amount of transmission network investment in order to unlock grid basically in the future. And the implementation of the infrastructure is basically a very long process when we talk about timelines. So it is mainly a short-term measure to try and use the infrastructure that we have to integrate as much renewables as we possibly can within obviously operational limits of the grid without affecting the reliability and security of supply within the country. So I think in simple terms, that's basically the two definitions we could we can give to what we mean when we talk about curtailment. In the context of generation, we were talking about capacity constraints. So that is the sort of curtailment that we're talking about now. Capacity constraints, and then we have the one that is related to system stability, which is the stability of the power system with regards to frequency. So those are the totally two separate things, but related somehow.
Thank you for that, Vuyo, and I guess you're bringing us back to the point of then, how do we manage the grid alongside multiple energy sources? Naniki, when it comes to keeping everything in balance, how do we address the challenges of integrating renewable energy while ensuring that the grid operates smoothly alongside other energy sources?
A point that Vuyo mentioned, that the two, or at least renewable energy sources, can coexist with non-renewable sources on the grid, is critical. From an grid operations perspective, essentially the system operator is there to make sure that the grid is stable, to make sure that they maintain that frequency to the 50 hertz, irrespective of what fuel sources is being connected to the grid. There's obviously initiatives that Eskom has put in place, and this is now from a grid access perspective, as we mentioned, this grid capacity allocation rules and so forth, to try to manage how we can ensure that the two can coexist, not only from a private public perspective, but also from your non-renewable to this renewable energy sources. So I think from that perspective, I do believe that the initiatives that has been put forward from Eskom has been what we see even internationally, to try to make sure that there is some sort of a systematic way that we can allocate grid to the projects and be able to make sure that eventually we are running a grid that is stable. Eventually we are able to supply our customers with a secure supply of electricity.
Thank you for that. And I guess as renewable energy continues to expand and grow, the grid then needs to be in a position, or must in fact evolve to meet the new demands. Vuyo, looking ahead at the future of our grid, what modernization efforts then are needed to make the grid more resilient and capable of handling increasing amounts of renewable energy?
There's quite a number of things that need to be really that require effort, and I think everyone is talking about for the past, I don't know how many, 2 years, probably 2.5 years now, is there a lot of effort that is required towards the upgrading of existing lines to enable them to carry higher loads is actually very key. I'm sure Naniki will cover this a bit later as well, but we have seen how capacity constraints have impacted the integration of renewable energy projects in the country. The quantum of wind, significantly reduced Cispin 5, and this is mainly due to this capacity constraint reason, and that is related to the infrastructure that we have on the ground. So, and we know that after preferred bidder announcement of B7 right now, which was submitted a couple of weeks ago, we can expect that the whole country will be basically constrained instead of just only the Cape regions. So at this point in time, you're actually very likely to get a cost estimate letter that does not include upstream strengthening requirements. So, and that basically just drives the cost of connection and it drives the tariff up. So the level of cost of energy continues to increase. So that is why a lot of effort needs to be really put into how we build out the infrastructure to try and enable a lot more renewables onto the system, but at the same time enable it to be more resilient, because we need to ensure that we still get to feed the needs of the customers accordingly. I think we also need to put a lot more effort into smart predictive tools that will help us monitor and plan better, I think, in terms of how we operate the grid. Automated systems similar to condition monitoring systems on equipment in terms of how they are constantly operating, that will enable system operators to have real-time data, and better position things like grid and power outages for maintenance, and help them predict or at least see issues before they happen, to try and avoid major disturbances. So this would really help reduce the downtime and help them allocate resources better. Secondly, I think this is also like quite a hot topic within the industry, is the use of AI in terms of forecasting tools as well. I think accurate prediction of both the demand as well as the generation of renewable energy is quite critical for system operator operations. So the system operator needs to know exactly when, where, and how much power they need to dispatch at a particular point in time. And if we as can use the, let's say, predictive tools to try and predict almost accurately how much renewable energy facilities will produce at a particular point in time, it will help try and improve and modernize how the system operator does basically planning. And we have seen how the requirement for accurate forecasting has increased over the years. With Building 5, we saw an introduction of the forecasting penalties, which basically seeks to penalize IPPs for forecasting inaccurately in terms of what they submit to Eskom. So we need to try and use a lot more sophisticated, smart and artificial intelligence tools that to help us accurate and predict wind and solar generation using weather data to try and assist in this regard. So it is quite important that we are able to try and predict both supply as well as demand in improving grid management. And in the end, it will help improve the integration of renewables and reduce the reliance on fossil fuels, because if you have enough generation that you can see coming from renewable energy power plants, you will be able to scale down your other generation plants that are not necessarily renewables to try and meet the consumer's needs. So it's a number of things that can be implemented, but I think these ones are the ones that are quite a hot topic right now that need quite a bit more attention and more investment in trying to move forward and looking at the grid of the future.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I guess an appreciation of points you've both made, in discussing around the cost estimate letters from Eskom and in positioning that or explaining that to ordinary public, it really speaks to the fact that there's often a perception that, IPPs are not actually contributing to overall grid infrastructure in the development of these projects. But I think it's a very important point to be made that as these projects are developed as part of, arriving at the overall project cost, a very key cost is the cost in terms of grid infrastructure, and any upgrades that are necessary for that. And also I think what you both are highlighting is the fact that as we have this energy mix and as we are then moving to the liberalization of the South African energy market, it really is going to require a continuous interactive process between IPPs, between Eskom, between the system operator, and really ensuring that we are managing all of these different energy sources. And I guess in essence and at the heart of it, the point that you've also just now made, Vuyo, is the fact that, modernization or modernizing the grid is going to be essential for us to really be able to meet future energy demands. But I guess, we can always look to the future, but there is some innovation that's already happening in real time. And Naniki, with ongoing advancements that are currently happening, what innovative solutions have you seen or have assisted in implementing that have helped streamline the grid connection process for renewable energy projects?
Thank you for the question, Toko. So when we talk about particularly the grid connection process, there's a study that I was involved in, at least to try to put in comments into that, which is talking towards grid connection, and it looked at a number of utilities across the world, within Italy, Chile, Brazil, as well as the US itself, and they looked at aspects around grid connection times and how best all of these utilities are compared to some of the processes that we have in South Africa. They looked at the queue management and some of their best practices around that, transparency of how they carry out the process of projects attaining a grid connection. They also looked at connection costs as well, to try to see from an infrastructure perspective, and probably towards the point that you mentioned earlier, how much of this grid costs adds up to the eventual project connecting on the grid and the financials of the project. It was interesting to see that we are not alone, and we not also there's learnings that we can gain from some of these utilities as well. And I think from a technology perspective, we know that the public procurement process had started with battery energy storage procurement, which obviously from a grid perspective, as you store some of these renewable energy excess renewable energy that is being generated, it helps alleviate the constraint and the bottleneck on the grid. Obviously, the aspect of curtailment that Vuyo talked to is something that is done internationally, and it's also a way of trying to manage as a technology to manage how we can get more projects onto the grid. Another aspect is around from a transmission grid perspective in terms of the power line and how much power you can push through on the lines, an aspect called dynamic line rating, which is not being utilized in South Africa, and it's been utilized in other utilities, that talks to and looks at weather conditions and how you can try to optimize how much power you can push through a power line at certain times. And I think that this also harnesses aspects of AI, as was alluded earlier, aspects of continual monitoring and live data management on the system. So those are some of the things that comes to my mind at the moment.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Very exciting innovations that seem to be happening globally. But I think it's also important that we, localize and understand our local challenges. And really the challenge we have regionally is that we have aging grid infrastructure. And that's a reality that we have to contend with as we seek to expand the use of the grid with additional energy. Vuyo, I'd like to bring you back into the conversation and just in terms of finding out from your perspective, how do we then balance innovation with the reality of older systems?
So I think we have seen in the past couple of months that the NTCSA is basically embarking on a big infrastructure rollout. We saw this, I think it was 2 months ago, when they basically announced the awarding of transformer contracts that seeks to basically try and alleviate capacity constraints within the existing network. And they spoke about 25 projects at key substations around the country. And in parallel with that, they are trying to expedite, I think probably around, I think they mentioned 20 something, I think it was 24 projects at different stages of the project life cycle, consisting of both transmission upgrades, distribution upgrades, new infrastructure, and it's not mainly limited to substations. It includes the plans to add about 14,000 kilometers of transmission lines. So with these plans that the NTCSA has, we should see improvements in terms of how our, let's say, how we deal with issues related to outages. We should see a reduction in terms of the number of outages we experience due to aging infrastructure, which will then improve the consumer's experience in terms of security of supply. And more importantly, the rollout that transmission is trying to embark on will unlock a lot more capacity for renewable energy power plants. They envision that between now and 2032, we should be able to unlock about 37 gigawatts of capacity to integrate more renewable energy power plants. I think it's very important to actually mention that I think the implementation and of the TDP, as well as the timelines related to these projects actually materializing, is quite critical for developers and everyone else at large, in terms of keeping the renewable energy industry alive and the market growing, because we cannot afford a situation where we have abandoned assets, because there is a lack of infrastructure to try and accommodate more renewables. So I think in a nutshell, there's a lot of work being done by the NTCSA to try and resolve the current challenges that we're currently having related to basically to aging infrastructure, as well as capacity constraints. There's a lot more efforts that will need to be put onto the municipal networks as well, because the electricity system does not end at the distribution substations. We also distribute power to sell power to the municipalities, and then they do the distribution to their load customers. So there's a lot more transformation and reform as well that will need to happen within the municipal networks and the municipal organizations, to try and keep up with the integration of more renewables, to try and strengthen their networks, to enable the infrastructure to handle the amount of renewables that will be coming in the next few years.
Thank you for that, Vuyo. And you know, aging infrastructure isn't really the only threat to the grid. Climate change is also creating new challenges that we need to prepare for. And Naniki, with increasingly extreme weather events that we've been seeing in South Africa of late, how does this affect the grid's reliability and resilience? And what measures can be taken to protect grid infrastructure from climate-related disruptions?
Thank you for the question. I think a very relevant one, as we're sitting here in Cape Town, where we've been experiencing such wet winter. So we remember the days of day zero, when I think it was in early 2023, after that whole protected La Nina effect, which is the opposite of the El Nino effect, what we know as when the system experiences, the environmental system experiences either very below average as well as above average temperatures. And that not only affects the environmental system, not only affects your agricultural infrastructure or space, but it also affects the power system. So from a power system perspective, and particularly power stations, you would recall times where Eskom would say we're experiencing load shedding because there's been very heavy rains up in the north that has affected the coal. We also know that in the summer months, for instance, that's when there's an increase of boiler tube leaks, and also a need for more cooling for the power stations. So definitely adverse weather does affect the power system. And I think the element of the power system that is more exposed to the weather is the grid. Like we said, that's the backbone that is traversing all of these provinces, particularly the transmission system. And with all of these weather effects, we've seen aspects of the drier months bringing with them fires, increase in fire events on the power system. And I think the utility has done immense work on working on this and collaborating with the disaster management institutes within the municipalities and the like, to try to make sure that there is some sort of resilience and risk afforded for these kind of events. Now bring it to the renewable space. We also know that all these projects are across the provinces, with a lot of PV in the northern areas and wind in the coastal western and eastern Cape. I think from that aspect, we don't really, at least I don't know of any adverse weather events that have affected this, except for a clip that comes to mind of that PV plant that is doing the flipping in the wind, and people were terming it a wind PV situation. But from a global aspect, I noted that, for instance, China also talked about experiencing peaks in terms of air conditioning load, because I guess in those kind of areas they get your commercial buildings, offices and that. So all of that adds to air conditioning, especially when they're experiencing these heat waves and things like that. In Europe and Canada, there was a report, I think it might be last year, where they were talking about the worst fire season that they've experienced in history. And I think these obviously would affect the power system. And from a mitigation perspective, I believe that I mentioned obviously the transmission substation being the largest that would be exposed to these weather events. And to assist in bringing more advanced monitoring for the power system, there's things such as wide area monitoring, which is sensors that provide minute and more resolute information that comes into the system operator, and they are able to react accordingly and obviously also plan accordingly in terms of what comes. Also, from a power station perspective, system operator would expect that, or at least they do a balancing of the demand and supply. So with all of these weather events, there's more reliance on, and also having more accuracy on your forecasting. So forecasting from a generator perspective, and I think this aspect is where your renewable projects, there was more of a focus on that in the latter bits. I think Vuyo mentioned that with your bid Windows 6, where they started tightening on errors with respect to forecasting data. So the need for having accuracy on your generators, as well as a need for more refinement and forecasting on the demand, will assist them to manage the power system better. And I think that's what comes to mind with respect to how we can be more resilient for these weather events.
Thank you very much for that, Naniki. And again, speaking to the fact that the grid is really the backbone of electricity supply. And I dare to say then that people are the backbone of the energy sector and remain a very key resource in the development of grid infrastructure. Vuyo, I'd like to bring you back in here, and you know, we've seen that that interdisciplinary collaboration is key in addressing any challenge in the South African energy sector. Could you share some examples where interdisciplinary collaboration was key to overcoming challenges in grid connection projects?
Thank you, Choco. I think, like you said, interdisciplinary collaboration is very important when it comes to implementation of these projects. I think a very typical example was basically the establishment of the renewable energy development zones. The development of the red zones was basically in consultation with a number of stakeholders within not just the renewable energy industry, but there was a lot of collaboration between all stakeholders, like the environmental departments and environmental specialists in general. And there was collaborations with communities as well as IPPs, municipalities, and the system operators and distribution operators at large in terms of developing these renewable energy development zones. So this whole process, it helped basically streamline how IPPs can connect to the grid. It is a very simple example of how collaborations have actually helped to try and overcome some of the challenges that we encounter with regards to connecting renewable energy projects. We have seen a lot on a more technical aspect. We have seen collaborations related to the ICA rules that Naniki's mentioned a bit earlier in our conversation. There's been a lot of work in the past year in terms of establishing the queuing rules in terms of how IPPs get to connect to the system, and that was efforts from both Eskom, the industry at large, as well the renewable energy industry at large, as well as the energy regulator. So there's quite a number of things. I think the second one would be, or the third one actually would be like the wheeling frameworks as the market liberalization process that is currently ongoing. There's quite a lot of public participation forums that are being held by different entities from NESA, Eskom, as well as IPPs to try and come up with solutions to overcoming some of the challenges that we currently have. So these are just a few of what can be regarded as examples that have contributed to alleviate or at least try and resolve some of the challenges that IPPs face when it comes to interconnection or connecting to the power system.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Vuyo. And as we near the end of this enlightening discussion, you've really touched on a point in terms of public consultation or public involvement. And it's essential to consider the public's understanding of grid management complexities. Naniki, how important is it that we educate the public and stakeholders about the complexities of grid management and the role of measures such as curtailment?
Thank you for that question. I think it's quite critical, right, to try to remove some of the blinders, if I can say. I do believe that it is important that that education continues to be done around these matters, to try to make sure that there is a broader understanding around the value chain of the power system, which makes up the grid, and that no entity should think that they are silos, that as we are connecting, be it I as a load customer, be it a generator, which is a private, be it a generator that is an Eskom owned generator, all of us are connecting to a dynamic power system that, that there is no island, right? So that for me is important, that all participants should understand that application should not be irregardless of everything else, as in the power system that you're connecting to. So definitely in support of initiatives that have been done around the industry bodies. And I think also appreciative of this platform as well, with some of the, I mean, I've listened to the previous podcasts, and I've also been learning on aspects of tariff, on aspects of the financing of the projects and the like. So yes, very important.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Naniki, and thank you very much for listening. Vuyo, and maybe just a final remark from your side. Naniki did touch on, initiatives that are being put in place by industry associations. But maybe you could expand on what are some of the efforts that are being made or should be made to improve understanding and support for grid-related decisions.
To be quite honest, there's been a lot of discussions amongst stakeholders in general, in trying to make all sort of stakeholders understand some of the challenges that we currently have. Like I mentioned earlier, there's been engagements with regard to the ICA rules that have been ongoing for probably the past year and a half. There's a lot of engagement currently going on with regards to the market code that was published by NERSA. And there's always, before any decision is made with regards to how things are being handled in terms of connecting to the power system, there's always public platforms that are being utilized to try and inform people, to try and inform the stakeholders at large. And it's quite important that these are taken seriously, I think, by all stakeholders, because it is the participation is required to try and ensure that the needs of everyone are basically streamlined and are basically taken into consideration. Because what we end up with as an end result needs to be a compromise between all stakeholders that that are involved, and the engineering department as well as the environmental department and the public can come up with all sorts of different innovative solutions to try and resolve the problem, but on their own they cannot necessarily do much. So we need to try and at all times bring that collaborative effort to bring our minds together to try to come up with the best solution that will work to try and resolve the problem, but at the same time taking care of the interests of everyone involved. So there's the platforms are there. It's really a matter of people and the industry at large making themselves available to engage with the bodies that hold these engagements, to engage with NERSA, because there's only so much that NERSA or Eskom can do to try and resolve problems. They need the effort and the contribution of everyone to try and make a decision that is going to basically take care of the needs of all industry stakeholders within the electricity supply industry. So there's quite a lot that is currently happening. It just requires participation from everyone, building out the grid and trying to resolve the challenges that we have is not going to be a one-man job. It's going to be a job that requires all hands on deck. So yeah, that's basically all I can say with regards to this matter on collaboration and efforts in terms of trying to inform the public and all stakeholders at large.
Thank you very much for that, Vuyo. I think, in essence, as members of the public, it is really important that we participate in the opportunities that we are given. I think sometimes we think of the energy sector as something that exists outside of us. That's happening somewhere over there with Eskom, with the engineers, with the IPPs. But I think what you've also just highlighted is that there's so much engagement that actually is going on. I mean, as you've said, before anything is passed, it is gazetted. So it is quite important for members of the public to then engage, to then seek out this information and participate in these processes. And that brings us to the end of today's episode of the Energy Conversations podcast. We've had a fascinating discussion on the challenges and opportunities surrounding grid management and renewable energy integration in South Africa. From understanding the core components of the grid to exploring how it can evolve to support more renewable energy, our guests have provided valuable insights into the future of the energy sector. A big thank you to our guests Naniki and Vuyolwethu, the grid queens, for sharing their expertise and perspectives. As South Africa continues to move towards a cleaner energy future, it is clear that innovation, collaboration, and engagement are going to be essential to make this transition successful. Thank you for joining us on yet another insightful episode of the Energy Conversations podcast. Stay tuned for more conversations and as we continue to explore the dynamic world of energy in South Africa.
Thank you for joining us on the Energy Conversations podcast, powered by Bayaka Infrastructure Partners, an authorized financial services provider, and the African Energy Leadership Center at the Wits Business School. Together, we are committed to empowering communities and fostering meaningful dialogue around the South African energy sector. Remember to subscribe and let's shape South Africa's energy future together.